Welcome to the UNCG MSAT Continuing Education Module on Evidence-Based Practice. This is Part 4, Likelihood Ratios. Please complete all 10 parts in the quiz that follows to receive your CEU. Let's begin. In Part 3, you learned about sensitivity and specificity. Those are probably the two most common statistical analysis the students are taught and will see in the evidence in the literature. Likelihood ratios, however, are actually better for diagnostic accuracy. However, they are much more confusing. What we teach our students at UNCG is not so much the calculation of likelihood ratios, but what they really mean when they see them reported in the literature. What likelihood ratios are is the pre-test to post-test shift in probability based on a statistical analysis. Positive likelihood ratios, noted here in the fourth bullet point, is the shift in probability that favors the existence of a condition, whereas a negative likelihood ratio is the shift in probability that favors the absence of the condition. The way this is determined statistically is a little confusing, so we try not to bog down our students in the statistical calculation. Instead, we focus on the interpretation of the likelihood ratios. We teach that a positive likelihood ratio greater than 10 or a negative likelihood ratio less than 1 are large and conclusive. This is what you want to see in your literature and your evidence when they present likelihood ratios. The closer either of those values are to 1, either a negative likelihood ratio being very high and close to 1, or a positive likelihood ratio being very low and close to 1, are very small and unimportant in the practical application of the test. If you look at the practical application, we're looking to convert that pretest probability back using what we call a nomogram. And this is where it gets really confusing for our students, so we try not to bog them down in this, and very rarely is a nomogram ever presented in the literature or the evidence that they will be reading. But this is what a nomogram looks like. You have a pretest probability noted here in the left column, a likelihood ratio located here in the middle column, and then your post-test probability. Again, likelihood ratios is a shift from this pretest to post-test probability. What you'll notice here is if you have a pretest probability of 40% and you have a likelihood ratio of 2, you'll notice that your post-test probability only raises to about 57%. It is a shift in the positive direction, but because the positive likelihood ratio is so small, you don't have a very large or conclusive shift in the probability. If we had a 40% pretest probability and a 50% likelihood ratio, you can imagine that this line will then, as it crosses through 50, become much higher and closer to a 95% post-test probability. Likelihood ratios are simply a shift in pretest to post-test probability, and again, we worry more about the interpretation with a positive likelihood ratio greater than 10 and a negative likelihood ratio closer to 0. In the next section, we'll go over an example using what you have learned in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 in an actual practical example from the evidence and from the literature.